Okay, today I am doing part 2 of the lecture on immigration. Part 1 was a few weeks ago. And so I'm continuing with this lecture on immigration. I'll continue for the next 2-3 days on immigration. The next 2 or 3 lectures. So beginning today with Cubans. It is in let's see. You'll recall that we learned about the Spanish-American War. We learned about the Platt Amendment, the U.S. base of Guantanamo Bay that, we've had there since the Spanish-American War till the present. Interventions in Cuba, U.S. military interventions in Cuba. Then in the 1950s, we had a lot of, so the United States supported the administration in Cuba. Then in 1959 is when Fidel Castro takes over Cuba with what he called his revolution. And then there were people who started fleeing Cuba because of the results of that revolution. Now, in the started in 1959, the 1960s, into the 1970s, the first people who left Cuba were the ones who stood to lose the most from a communist government. So the people who left were the wealthy, the professional, the educated, the conservative, and also disproportionately white people of Cuba. Right off the bat, from 59 to 1962, there were about 250,000. There were also what's remembered as the Peter Pan flights, where people would put minors, children into airplanes to escape Cuba. 14,000 were brought to the US. Then in the second half of that, they had what they called freedom flights. That's another almost 300,000. And so again, these are the people who initially left, the ones who stood to lose the most from a communist government. During that, or right after that, the United States trained refugees from Cuba to go back to Cuba and try to take it over. It's called the Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961. They thought, so the US, they took off from the US. They were trained in the US, supplied by the US, and they thought that they would land on Cuba at the Bay of Pigs, and that the Cuban people were going to rise up against Castro, and that was going to help them take the country. But that did not happen. So they ended up, getting captured. Now, the one important distinction for Cubans compared to Mexican Americans and Puerto Ricans, etc. Cubans are unique in that they tend to identify not as immigrants. They identify as political refugees. And so they have this sense that they didn't leave because they chose to look for better opportunities, but that they left because they were forced to leave for political reasons. And with that is also this subtext, especially for those earlier waves, that one day they're gonna get rid of Castro and his revolution, and that they're gonna go back and reclaim, go back to Cuba. And so they, and many just never did, or there are actually, the US and Cuba allow Cubans to go to Cuba to visit or do whatever and come back and forth. But especially those early wave people, a lot of them would say they just, they wouldn't go back if, while Castro's revolution was still being implemented. In 1980, we had another wave of refugees from Cuba. These were the Marielitos. In 1980, there were 125,000. The Marielitos were people who wanted to leave Cuba, and Cuba told them, okay, you want to leave? Go ahead, leave. And while you're at it, why don't you take these people with you? Fidel Castro, emptied out his prisons and released those people together with the Marielitos. And so this gave, this was the beginning of later waves of Cubans not being as welcomed to the United States as that first wave in the 1960s. They got the reputation for being criminals. Now, there probably were some criminals in Cuban prisons that were among them, but even the people that were released from prison would not be criminals in the United States. Some of those people were in prison because they were gay. Some people were in prison because they were political prisoners, because they were opponents of Fidel Castro, not because they were murderers or something like that. And so, but at any rate, the US public was afraid of the Marielitos. They were no longer wealthy and white and educated and all these other things. And among them were some people who were criminals. So yeah, this made the public afraid. Instead of welcoming them with open arms the way the ones from the 1960s were welcomed, these were taken to military bases, and then they try to find sponsors to release them to. One of those military bases was in Wisconsin, in Sparta, Wisconsin, over kind of closer to La Crosse. And actually, in case anyone's interested in doing a research paper on this, I think it's Wisconsin Public Radio, together with a professor from La Crosse, did a bunch of interviews that are available online regarding those Cuban refugees that were held in Sparta, Wisconsin when they first arrived. And then they talk about then staying in Wisconsin after that. And so there's lots of interviews online, I think through Wisconsin Public Radio, in case you're curious to write your paper on this and want to make use of those sources. So yeah, they get, they get a bad reputation. It's from that we get, from that reputation, we get the movie, I think it's Scarface, where the one that says, say hello to my little friend, and starts shooting a machine gun. He's supposed to be a Cuban Marielito. And so yeah, that helped, or didn't help, it helped to promote that portrayal of Cubans. Then in 1994, we have another wave, the Balseros. Balsa means raft. And so the balseros were the people who came in rafts. And so you could see kind of this progression where, over here, we were sending commercial airlines to pick people up. By this point, there were private boats from the US would go and pick up the Marielitos and bring them back. And then by the next wave, the only way they could get here is on makeshift rafts. And so you could see sort of the decline in degree to which the different waves were welcomed and the resources that were made available. By this point, we had something, well, a couple things here. After the Marielitos, we initiated what is referred to as wet foot, dry foot policy. And so in 1980, we still had, the Cold War was still in full swing. And so we still wanted to support Cubans fleeing Cuba because they had a communist government. But we still changed our policy to a wet foot, dry foot policy. Wet foot, dry foot means that if the US Coast Guard caught Cubans out at sea, they were wet foot, they would get picked up and taken straight back to Cuba. However, if they managed to somehow make it to the United States and touch on dry land, then they were dry foot, then they would be admitted into the United States. And so that's part of the process of us just not being as welcoming as we were, even though the Cold War was still in full swing. By the time of the Balseros, however, the Cold War was over. The Berlin, the Berlin Wall had come down. So the Cold War was over. And at that point, so we don't have the Cold War incentive to welcome them anymore. And also things had gotten worse in Cuba because with the Cold War ending, Cuba no longer had its major trading partner. It's one of its only trading partners, of the Soviet Union. And so then they went through what they called their special period, which was just meant, like their own Great Depression, their own period of bad economic period. And even though the Cold War ended, we did not put an end to what we call the Cuban embargo, which is really a US economic embargo against Cuba. The Cuban embargo is a US embargo against Cuba, where all the different economies of the world, the different corporations of the world, they need to pick between the United States and Cuba. If they trade with that little island, they cannot trade with the United States. And so then that becomes the way in which the US hurts the Cuban economy. And even though the Cold War ended in, say, around 1990, 1991, till this day, in 2015, we still implement the Cuban embargo, even though the Cold War is long gone. So the balseros were people who got on rafts in 1994, 30,000 of them, trying to flee the economic pains that Cuba was going through in the early 90s after the end of the Cold War. 30,000 of them made it to the United States. Cubans are one of the largest Latino groups in the United States, but they make up only 4% of Latinos in the US today. Cubans are also known for being the Latino group that leans right-wing the most of any Latino group. In fact, I think it is because of Cuban Americans that we haven't ended the Cuban embargo or normalized relations with Cuba till this day. So yeah, from Cuban Americans in the United States, they tend to lean 2/3 of them toward Republicans, 1/3 toward Democrats, whereas it's the opposite for most other Latino groups. And so it's from Cuban Americans that we get, the Ted Cruz's, the Marco Rubios in government politics in the US today. Moving on to the Immigration Act of 1965. The Immigration Act of 1965 was a major change from what had existed before. Before, it was based on the 1924 immigration law. That's the one we learned about before that was based on national origin. And that 1924 law had focused on limiting immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe. But it also set future immigration based on what country someone was coming from. The Immigration Act of 1964 changed it to these two new priorities. One was family reunification, and the other was skilled labor. It is still the basis for current immigration laws in the United States today. Since 1965, we established this new foundation, and it is still the foundation upon which current immigration law is based. Now, like pretty much every immigration law, there's always unintended consequences. We thought that with family reunification, or the makers of this law thought that with family reunification, it was going to be, the relatives, people who are already here, legally here, born here, are going to bring their relatives from other parts of the world. What they did not imagine is that most of those people were going to be from Latin America or Asia. So that's one of the unintended consequences of the Immigration Act of 1965. Since then, legal, not illegal, but legal, starting with the letter L, immigration to the United States has been from Latin America and Asia, the majority. So it was a big shift, started in 1965. Let's look at more detail, specifically at those two main points for family reunification and skilled labor. So with family reunification being a priority of this Immigration Act, there's no limit for how many spouses or unmarried children of US citizens can be brought to the United States. And so any US citizen could marry a foreigner and bring that person over. And there's no limit for that. Yeah, unmarried children. It used to be they could also bring their parents. That has been changed. And then there's other categories of people that are not the spouse or unmarried children. For family-sponsored visas, 226,000 people per year, and I haven't checked that number if it's how much it's changed in the last 10 years or so, if at all. So these are priorities, 1 through 4 are priorities. So a priority goes to unmarried children over the age of 21. Then to the spouse and children of US permanent residents. Then to married, sons and daughters of US citizens. Then to the siblings of US citizens. So that's the priorities for family-sponsored visas. Now, there's also this other point that I think is a huge point that the media don't talk about often enough, and therefore so many people don't understand this major limitation in US immigration law. No one country in the world can have more than 7% of this number come in through family-sponsored visas. It doesn't matter if you're one of the largest countries in the world, or if, or the smallest, small country, or whether you're in the opposite side of the globe or right next door. The same 7% limit applies. So as a result, there is a 22-year backlog for people coming from Mexico to be able to come legally through family-sponsored visas. Yes. 7% of the visas that are granted under this family-sponsored category. Yeah. So for example, if the people who were allowed to come in legally from Mexico in September of 2019, they needed to have applied in January of 1997. I have two cousins who live and work in Minnesota, who applied and were granted, allowed to come to the US through these family-sponsored visas. And I think one of them waited 17 years, the other one 19 years. And so, when people talk about, just get in the back of the line, or, my wife was able to come here, and we did it the right way. A, there's no limit for spouses, and B, the line is not the same for everyone. Depending on what country you're coming from, the line can be 20 years, a 20-year wait. If your family is barely surviving from hunger, or if your family is being threatened by drug cartels, to kill you, you don't have the luxury of waiting 20 years to be admitted legally. So the Immigration Act of 1965 prioritized family and prioritized skilled labor. For employment-based visas, that's 140,000 per year, but all the preferences are for highly skilled workers. These tend to be temporary. They have to be employer-sponsored, and it's very common for these people to have to leave annually. And so, yeah, for example, here in the languages department, I know we've had people from Spain who teach Spanish here, and they've had to leave every year to fulfill the requirements of being able to stay here legally. And then the state of Wisconsin will only make their IDs or driver's licenses valid for the amount of time that they're allowed to stay here legally. So every year they got to go back to the DMV to renew their license. So there's just a lot of hurdles. Now, there are a couple ways in which people can come if they don't fall into these two categories. There is something called the diversity visa lottery, where 50,000 people per year are admitted. But it really is like a lottery. It really is luck. 50,000 people per year are accepted, but they get 22 million applications for those 50,000 spots. There's also asylum, people who come here as refugees. And in that case, the amount of people that are admitted is up to the discretion of the administration that's in power. And so here's some examples where in 2017, President Obama was allowing 110,000 refugees to come in per year. When President Trump came in, he lowered it to 45, then to 30, then to 15. President Biden took it the other way, increased it to 62, and then to 125 and 125. Now, the thing also about people who are accepted as refugees, refugees tend to be admitted in a with temporary status. One term for that is TPS, temporary protected status. And so it doesn't mean that they're allowed to stay here forever. And I'll talk more about that in a second. So with these two exceptions, there's not a lot of paths, ways for people who don't have family in the US and who don't have a high skill or high education to come into the United States legally. Because to come to the US legally, you either have family, or you're highly skilled, or you win the lottery, or if you happen to be admitted as a temporary refugee. I wanted to introduce you with this list to the different types of status that people can have in the United States. Because a lot of times the public or the media makes it seem like you're either a US citizen or you're illegal. And that's not how it works. It's a lot more complicated than that. If you're a US citizen, you're either born in the US or you are naturalized. Naturalized means that you came in as a temporary resident, then you became a permanent resident, and then once it was time, you applied to become a US citizen. And so you went through that path, you were naturalized. Some people are permanent residents. They're also referred to as a green card holder. The government uses the term resident alien. And typically you have to be a permanent resident for 5 years before you can apply to be naturalized as a US citizen. Before being a permanent resident, you have to be a temporary resident. This is also called a conditional permanent resident, in which case you need to do that for at least 2 years before you move on to permanent resident and then to US citizen. And it doesn't happen automatically. You have to apply and pay for all the fees. By the way, all of these things are not funded by US citizen tax dollars. All these offices, the USCIS office is funded by the people who apply for these things. So when people apply to become a permanent resident, they'll pay like $900 for just to turn in the form and then wait their 20-year, waiting period, depending on where they're from, and so forth. So, yeah. Then we have non-immigrant visas. There are 35 different types of non-immigrant visas. These are for people who come to visit. It could be like student visas, exchange students, tourists, people who come here for business purposes, religious purposes, say reporters from other countries, diplomats from other countries, or people who come here to work. So there's lots of different types of non-immigrant visas. So these non-immigrant visas do not automatically lead to temporary resident, permanent resident, and then to be able to apply to be a citizen. Then we have people who are refugees, who are seeking asylum, who are given temporary protected status. And so there's lots of people from Latin America, especially Central Americans, but also people from the Caribbean, like Haiti, and Nicaraguans, and Salvadorans, and Guatemalans, who, in the case of Central Americans, came here in the 1980s because of the civil wars in the 1980s, and they were given TPS, temporary protected status. This TPS was only for 2 to 3 years at a time. So every 2 to 3 years, they would go back to USCIS, renew their TPS for another 2 to 3 years. And so there's people that have been living in the US since the 1980s, renewing it every 2 to 3 years. Now, during the first Trump administration, there were lots of Salvadoran people in particular whose TPS were not renewed. After being here for decades, they showed up to renew it like they had for the last couple decades. And they found out on the spot that they weren't just there to renew it, they were going to get deported. Then we get to people who are undocumented or out of status, or that the government refers to illegal aliens. So undocumented, meaning you don't have documents to legally be here. Out of status recognizes that actually a lot of the people who are here undocumented or illegally are people who came here legally. And I forget the percentage, but somewhere between 40 and 60% of the people who are here illegally are out of status, came here legally and then overstayed their visa. They're not the people crossing the border illegally. A huge percentage are people who came here legally and then overstayed. And so, yeah. Okay, moving on a little bit to a slightly different topic, that topic of Central America in the 1980s. You read a chapter by Gonzalez, I think it was chapter 8, about this. I'll touch on some of that information right now. One of the first things to notice is that the people from Nicaragua had an easier time being accepted into the United States than the people from El Salvador and Guatemala. All three of them had civil wars. All three of them had US involvement in those civil wars. And so they were all people from all three countries were fleeing those civil wars. The difference was that in El Salvador and Guatemala, the United States supported their governments that were in power. And so anyone fleeing those governments anyone fleeing those governments would not be recognized by the United States as people who had to flee these oppressive governments because we supported those governments. In Nicaragua, on the other hand, the Sandinistas came into power, and the US was funding a secret war to try to get rid of them, funding the Contras. And so anyone who fled Nicaragua, similar to Cuba, was more readily recognized as a political refugee who was leaving a terrible government because we were opposed to that government. A little bit more detail regarding El Salvador. There's a significant amount of religion or religious people played a role. Let's see. Throughout Latin America, there was a growing popularity of something called liberation theology. This is where there was a growing number of people within the Roman Catholic Church in Latin America who were being influenced by liberation theology. And then that was being relayed to the people who would go to Catholic Church. Previously, the Roman Catholic Church kind of had this idea of, you know, you live in a poor third world country, you know, you live under dictatorship, you have a lot of corruption, you know, well, at least you're gonna have heaven. And so be a good Catholic, and this life is terrible, but you're gonna have a better life in heaven. That was kind of the old policy. Liberation theology instead said, you know what? It's okay to try to create a better world today while you're still alive, and not just wait for a better world in heaven. That's kind of the essence of liberation theology. On that note, El Salvador had a bishop named Oscar Romero, and he was starting to become really popular, you know, because there was a growing, the Salvadoran government's military was increasingly targeting its own people. And Oscar Romero was increasingly speaking out against the government. He was so popular, you know, his sermons in a big cathedral would be standing room only. They had to put speakers outside so people can stand outside and listen to him. That wasn't enough. Then they started putting them on the radio so that people could listen to him from home. But obviously the government didn't like that, nor did the paramilitary groups. Paramilitary groups were people who supported the government and would do the dirty work of the government and the military. But the government and the military could, you know, say that wasn't us. You know, that massacre was a paramilitary group. We didn't do that. But they were doing the government's bidding and the military's bidding. So Oscar Romero, one of his last sermons, called out to the soldiers of El Salvador and said, Christianity says thou shalt not kill. And before the law of man is the law of God. That was it. That was the last complete sermon he gave. The next one he gave, he was in the middle of mass giving a sermon, and a sniper shot him and killed him right in front of everyone. So that was the murdering of Romero, of Archbishop Romero, who is now canonized by the Roman Catholic Church as a saint. When he was murdered, assassinated, that's when the Salvadoran public really, became, really stood up in arms against the Salvadoran government. And joined the FMLN, the Frente, let's see. No, the Faribundo Martí, Frente Maribundo Martí, Frente Maribundo, man, this is embarrassing, I don't remember it. Oh, I did get it right. Frente Maribundo Martí de Liberación Nacional, the Maribundo Martí Front of National Liberation. So thank you. The Salvadoran people, flocked to this group, who was a rebel group fighting against Salvadoran military. The United States was supporting the Salvadoran government. They gave $4.2 billion in aid for their military. And so the US supported the government, even after the assassination of Romero. But then there was a handful of nuns from the United States that also got murdered by the Salvadoran government or the military or the paramilitary. That's when US public opinion turned against the Salvadoran government, and when Congress said, okay, let's stop supporting this government. This civil war led to between 5 and 20% of the whole Salvadoran population. It's a small country, but still, 5 to 20% of the country fled to the United States because of all this violence, because of the Civil War. But when they'd arrived to the United States, again, most of them would not be recognized as political refugees because they were leaving a government that we supported. The story in Guatemala was very similar. The US supported the Guatemalan government. The Guatemalan government also had the government, its military, its paramilitary or death squads, in particular, would target indigenous people. They would portray indigenous people as communists. You know, again, this is all in the context of the Cold War. They portrayed them as communist sympathizers, and so they would disproportionately attack indigenous people. Now, these terrible things that Latin American government militaries did to their own people, the United States actually trained them to do that. The United States had something called the School of the Americas. It was initially in Panama. Then it was in Honduras, where we were training the people that were fighting the Contras, fighting in Nicaragua. And then eventually we move it into the US state of Georgia. And it's still around today, although in the early 2000s, they rebranded to a new name because the School of the Americas got a bad rap. But during the Cold War, the United States trained the military officers of Latin American countries on how to fight communism. We didn't want communism to take root in the Americas, especially after Cuba happened. And so a lot of the things the Latin American countries did to their own people are things that the US trained them how to do in the School of the Americas. And a lot of the governments, the dictators that were in power, you know, these dictators were not in power in spite of US democracy. They were often there because we helped put them there and supported them to stay there as the dictators of these countries. In Nicaragua, they had another organization called the Frente Sandinista de Liberación Nacional, the National Sandinista Liberation Front. People just refer to them as the Sandinistas. They got rid of the Somozas in the 1970s. The Sandinistas came into power in the 80s, and the United States didn't like the Sandinistas. We liked the Somozas that they got rid of. And so then we would fund the Contras to get rid of the Sandinistas. And we would do that from Honduras, where we had the School of the Americas training. The Boland Agreement is a US congressional agreement where we said, okay, you know, hopefully we've learned our lesson. We've supported a lot of bad people. You know, how about let's say we no longer do this. Let's no longer topple governments and so forth in Latin America. So then we had the US continued supporting the Contras secretly because the Boland Agreement said we weren't going to do this anymore. And that's how the Iran-Contra scandal came to light and became a scandal, because we found out that even though US Congress had said we weren't going to do this anymore, it turns out the Reagan administration was still doing this.
Somebody falls, just got they found the pain in a closet. Some kind of barrel paper, his name was Albert. He and Reagan went around the chest, hey, Congress. I'm the stuff they call him Rack. He'll always be a great ally. Then he gave the products for the conference. Genius. The sales were uncovered by the press. Reagan and Northland began to stress. Because what they did was technically by treason. It was totally justified. Here to take the blame. The same way Congress might say. The Secretary with his secretary. Thanks to his solidarity. He got a total
Yeah, so yeah, the Iran-Contra scandal was a scandal because it was discovered, it was discovered that the United States was still indirectly funding. And then after, during this and after this, there's also a lot of there's a lot of evidence, although unconclusive, that the CIA was allowing the Contras to smuggle crack cocaine to the United States in the 1980s as a way for them to be able to continue funding themselves to fight this war against the Sandinistas, which helps lead to the crack epidemic in the United States in the 1980s and the growth of street gang violence in the 1980s as well. And so lots of things interconnected. What happened in the 1980s with regard to immigration law? In 1980, we passed a Refugee Act. The Refugee Act makes it so that we define, who we can admit as refugees. And it tends to be people who are leaving a country because of persecution from their government. And that persecution needs to be because of race, class, or religion or political ideology. And so just because you're poor and fleeing a country, or because there's no economic opportunity in a country, is not a reason that is recognized for refugees. In the 1980s, we have the sanctuary movements. Today, we might occasionally hear people talk about sanctuary states or sanctuary cities and things like that. That goes back to the 1980s and the sanctuary movements. This is when churches in the United States, they had this idea that because of separation of church and state, churches could provide sanctuary to these people from Central America who were not recognized by the United States as being legitimate political refugees. And so they would give them sanctuary to be able to stay in their churches. And they had this idea that back then it was called the INS, today we call it ICE, couldn't go in there, arrest someone and deport them. But we now, the government has established its right to go into churches. That separation of church and state doesn't forbid them from going into churches and arresting people. Although they try not to do it because it's a sensitive space. Recently, the Trump administration kind of doubled down on that and kind of just made it clear that they had the right to do that. yeah, just kind of preemptively. It's in the 1980s when we first came up with this TPS, temporary protected status, that did allow to created more opportunity to be able to see people like Salvadorans and Guatemalans as people that were legitimate political refugees. In 1986, this was the last time that US Congress passed something resembling comprehensive immigration reform. It's called the Immigration Reform and Control Act, IRCA for short. It gave amnesty to 2.7 million undocumented people. So that means that there were, just that there were close to 3 million people who were here illegally and had a path to become legalized, to become temporary legal residents and then permanent legal residents, and then could apply to become US citizens if they wanted to. And by the way, I'll talk more about this later. My parents became permanent US residents. They were already temporary legal residents, but they became permanent legal residents through IRCA, through this law. And so it was a compromise between liberals and conservatives. On the one hand, it allowed a path toward legalization for the undocumented. And on the other hand, there was a crackdown component of it where it made it illegal for employers to employ the undocumented. But there was very little enforcement of this. Basically, employers, starting in 1986, employers were required to ask for an ID and a social security number. And so as long as employers ask for an ID and a social security number, you know, they make a copy, or today they might scan it and keep it in a file. That's all they need to do to protect themselves from hiring undocumented workers, so that the government can't penalize them. And it's been politically unpopular to penalize the employers. Although I would argue that if the US ever gets serious about cracking down on undocumented immigration, I think that would actually be the way to do it, would be to require everyone, you know, to confirm their, you know, in order to work, to be able to prove social security number and ID, and cracking down on the employers, not just on the immigrants. But we've never been willing to do that. Never been willing to do that since the 1980s to the present. In the 1990s begins the building up of the US-Mexico border. It's in the 1990s, and then I have it on there because ironically, as the Cold War ends and the Berlin Wall comes down, the US-Mexican border wall begins to go up. Now, we've always had official points of entry, and but in the 1990s, they started building walls close to those points of entry. And so here you see in 1990, 11 miles of fence, 13 miles of floodlights. President Clinton did something called Operation Gatekeeper with this idea of, you know, because what people used to do is they would just go to the official port of entry, go right around it, and keep going into the US. With the building of a bigger barrier around the official ports of entry, that has meant that now people have to go way around, usually to the middle of nowhere desert, in order to cross illegally. And so another unintended consequence of the building of the border wall has been increasing number of deaths of immigrants, especially in southern Arizona. Here's some numbers. Let's see, in 2012, there was 477. From 1998 to 2012, there were 7,000 border deaths. Other similar numbers from 1997 to 2017, according to Border Patrol, there were over 7,000 bodies found, although some claim the number would be more than 3 times that. And again, you see, you know, sort of how many people die along the US-Mexico border, and south of Tucson being the area with the highest number of deaths. Ten minutes. Yeah, I don't have that. 10 minutes is not going to be enough for NAFTA. So I think I'll stop there for today.